Medieval Scotland was a brutal place to be, and arguably the most brutal thing about it was the justice system. There were no slaps on the wrist back then, no community service, no early parole, and even prisons didn't really exist back then the way that we think of them now. Prisons were only used to hold the accused before trial. If they were convicted, the punishment they could expect to receive was a lot more creative than that. That big grey building over my shoulder is Aberdeen Townhouse. It was built in the 1870s. But if you look a little bit closer, you'll see that contained within the structure of that big grey building is a much older building. It has a different colour of brick to the rest of the townhouse, brown instead of grey. That structure is the toll booth. In medieval times, the town hall would have been traditionally where the council collected tolls and customs duties. In addition to that, this toll booth also contained a prison and a court. This one behind me was built in the 16th century, but it replaced a much older building that dates back to the 14th century. And prior to that, there was a toll booth in the Aberdeen Harbour area, but no one is exactly sure where that one stood. So in medieval times, if you were accused of a crime, this is where you would be imprisoned and subsequently tried. I found some drawings of what the toll booth would have looked like back then, a much smaller building than this one. Obviously the city was much smaller back then. I think it's great that as the city grew, they chose to incorporate the old toll booth building within the larger structure of the townhouse instead of just demolishing it altogether. So after the trial was finished, assuming you were convicted, what would your punishment be? Well, that really depended on how serious the crime was. For extremely minor crimes, then you might have gotten away with just paying a fine. But if you couldn't afford to pay the fine, then you would most likely be sentenced to some sort of public humiliation or public shaming. And this would typically take place right here. This is the Market Cross. The word market is just an old Scots word for market, and it signified the centre of the market in the city. This one here is only about 300 years old, and prior to that they would have used a more basic wooden cross to mark this spot, and obviously that's been lost to time. Every city in Scotland has got a market cross, and in medieval times they used to chain people to it. The guy responsible for chaining people to the market cross was the city's hangman. Back then that was literally a job title. You could work for the council as the city's hangman. Aside from the fact that you had to torture and execute people, it really wasn't a bad job. You got paid about £2 a month, if my maths is correct, and then you get paid a bonus of about 200 quid in today's money every time you had to actually execute someone. The hangman also got a free house back then, and it would have been located on the hill just behind these buildings here, just above Virginia Street, which is the main road at the bottom of the hill, which is why back then people used to call that hill Hangman's Brae. Funnily enough, in the year 1588, the city's hangman, a guy called James Patterson, was himself sentenced to hang. So the question is, did he have to hang himself? And was he paid for hanging himself? I guess we'll never know. The next step up from public humiliation for slightly more serious crimes was public flogging, and it happened right here on the corner of Broad Street and Union Street. For hundreds of years, men and women would be publicly flogged right there where that square of cobblestones is, with a contraption made out of birch branches. For adults, you could be sentenced to 36 lashings, but for kids under the age of 14, 12 was the maximum. It was abolished for women in the year 1817, but men continued to be publicly flogged for several years after that. It was moved indoors, at least, in the year 1830, presumably so men could maintain some semblance of dignity whilst being whipped with a bunch of twigs. Whipping was often used as a punishment for women accused of being a prostitute. It wasn't easy being a woman in medieval times. And in fact, some crimes only existed for women. An example of this was the crime of being too outspoken or argumentative, basically talking too much. And the punishment for that used to take place right here in front of me in Aberdeen Harbour. This is the oldest part of the harbour. It used to be called Quay Head, and I believe it's now called Trinity Head. It was at the bottom of Shore Brae, which is this road to my right. And this is a location right here where for hundreds of years, women who were too outspoken were strapped to a chair and lowered over and over again into Aberdeen Harbour to persuade them not to talk too much. So what about serious crimes? More serious even than talking too much. Well, actually, it might surprise you to learn what was considered a serious crime in medieval times. Obviously, murder and treason have always been considered serious, but in addition to that, crimes like counterfeiting, arson, and even poaching were considered to be in the same category. For all of these crimes, the punishment was death. And for most regular people, the method of execution was hanging. You'd be sentenced at the toll booth and then transported, presumably by horse and cart, to one of two locations. The closest execution site was Port Hill, which is on a street called Gallowgate, meaning way to the gallows. This street was the main road into the city in medieval times, so they'd actually leave the condemned up on the hill, hanging, to act as a deterrent for anyone thinking about coming to Aberdeen and causing trouble. A little bit further away is Gallows Hill, and to get there the condemned would first travel down Justice Street and then along an old road, which is now Park Road. Many of the people executed here were actually buried into the hill, and some of their remains were unearthed in the 1800s when this site was excavated. I guess the hangman eventually got sick and tired of commuting up the Gallowgate or to Gallows Hill, because eventually the gallows were moved to basically right in front of the toll booth building, and there's still a square of old cobblestones that marks the exact spot where the gallows used to be. From the year 1776, all of the public hangings that took place in Aberdeen took place right here. This street right in front of where the gallows used to be would have been full of people. And believe it or not, back then, parents used to take their kids to see people get hung. It was like a form of entertainment. These days, if the weather's not too bad, people will sit outside this pub and get drunk, literally within spitting distance of where people used to be strangled to death. The last public hanging in Aberdeen took place right here in the year 1857. A guy called John Booth was convicted of killing his mother-in-law and sentenced to hang. Seems a bit harsh. I would have let him off with a warning. I said that hanging was the most common method of execution for regular people, because if you were rich and powerful, you didn't get hung like a common criminal. Instead, you were beheaded. And that took place right over here on this side of Castle Hill, which for obvious reasons used to be called Beheading Hill. For example, in the year 1574, a guy called John Ewan was beheaded here. And the crime he was convicted of was called coining. Now, coining basically meant either manufacturing fake coins or shaving the edges of real coins. Back then, there were coins in circulation made of gold and silver. So you can imagine how much money could be made by selling the shavings. Anyway, John wasn't just some common criminal, he was a burgess of Aberdeen, which is why he was beheaded instead of being hung. And it happened right here It was thought at the time that beheading someone was a bit more dignified than hanging them, and probably a little bit quicker. It's said that the ghosts of the men who were beheaded here haunt the halls of this school, and every now and again a child will ask the teacher, "Who's that man over there in the corner with no head?" Okay, I made that last part up. I mean, it could be true.